Okay, just a quick note before we get started today. Remembering 360 degrees from yesterday is equal to 2 pi radians if we're talking about radians. Then pi is equal to 180. Then if we're looking at a triangle, and this angle here is 30 degrees, then we can also call that 180 divided by 6 equals 30, so pi over 6 is the same angle as 30 degrees, but in radians. So if I was talking about sine of 30 degrees, that'd be me talking about sine of pi over 6, which in your calculator, either way, is going to be 0.5. Right, so today we're going to talk about reciprocal trig functions. Now before we get into these, an important note. That there, as you've seen in your calculator, is an inverse trig function. It's not the same as a reciprocal trig function. Reciprocal from fractions is just meaning flipping, so sine, the reciprocal will be 1 over sine. So if the sine of an angle is equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse, then the reciprocal trig function will be equal to the hypotenuse over the opposite. The reciprocal trig function of cos is called secant or sec, and it just means the opposite, h over a. 1 over sine is cosecant or cosec, and it's equal to h over o, and 1 over tan is equal to cotangent or cot, and it's just equal to the adjacent over the opposite. Just the exact opposites of what we had with the regular SOHCAHTOA. Right. So if I had, for instance, sine equals O over h, divided it by cosine, which as you know is A over h, then we can cancel out the hypotenuse in each. And that leaves us with sine over cos is equal to O over a. Now from SOHCAHTOA, we know that O over a is equal to tan. So here we have a quick proof that tan is equal to sine over cos. Cotangent is equal to 1 over tan, so if we flip the tan, we flip the sine over cos, and that gives us a quick trig identity that cotangent is equal to cos over sine. A trig identity is like a relationship or a shortcut that proves two things are equal to each other. Well, actually it's the shortcut, so you don't have to prove two things are equal to each other every time. Right. So if I was asked to evaluate cosec of pi over 6, then you could look at your calculator and try and do that, but there's no cosec button. So what you could do is remember that cosec is in fact 1 over sine. So you can work out sine equals pi over 6. We did that before. That is 1 over 0.5, because sine of pi over 6 is 0.5. And there you see that we've got the answer of 2. Okay. Here's a quick trig identity that is going to be quite basic but very important. If sine equals O over h, then sine squared equals O over h squared. This is just notation to put the squared there. We always do it, but what it means is the whole thing squared. Now here's Desmos showing you the sine graph. It'd be good if you could do this on your own as well. Just desmos.com/calculator. So here I've plotted the graphs of sine squared and cosine squared, which just takes the input angle and then squares the answer. So I'll just put in a random value, 1.2345, and we can see that the value of cosine squared and the value of sine squared adds together to give you 1. So here I'll plot this as a single function now, and you can see that at any value, sine squared plus cosine squared is always equal to 1. Right, so here's our relationship written again. This is our trig identity, very basic one. If you ever see sine squared plus cosine squared, you can just substitute that in to be 1. That is provided, of course, that x is the same angle in both parts of that function. Right, so if I take this function, this equation, and divide everything, both sides, by cosine squared, I don't really need that plus sign in there. Sine squared over cos squared plus cos squared over cos squared equals 1 over cos squared. Now I've done the same thing to both sides, so there's no effect on the equal sign, so it's still true. And if I, well, what is sine over cos? Now, sine over cos is, as you remember from before, is equal to tan. So sine over cos squared is equal to tan squared. And 1 over cosine squared is equal to, well, 1 over cosine is equal to sec. So 1 over cosine all squared is going to be equal to sec squared. Not 1 over sec squared, sec squared. Right, so taking what we've just shown on the side here, I can substitute in tan squared. Cos squared over cos squared is of course 1, and that is equal to sec squared of x. Once again, x has to be the same thing on both sides, but this is the same thing. This sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1 is exactly the same equation as tan squared plus 1 equals sec squared. It's an identity, which means it's written differently, and we've seen that the shortcut holds true. So if you ever want to use that identity, you can, and you will. Right, so that's the second form. Taking the original equation, sine squared plus cos squared equals 1. Here's the third form. Now I'm not going to prove this one for you. The third form of this is to say cot squared plus 1 is equal to cosec squared of x. Now, rather than me prove it, I would like you to have a go at proving it and bring it in tomorrow, and we'll see if you get the right answer if you manage to do it. Otherwise, I'll put it on the board. Right. Here's another trick. This one's just a random trig identity, and I won't say I made it up, but I just made this question up. Now these two sides are equal, or at least that's my claim, and my job here is to prove this trig identity or this relationship. Right, so what does it mean to prove a trig identity? Well, it means we're going to take one side of this equation and hopefully be able to prove that it's equal to the other side using algebra, using all the laws of algebra that we know without breaking any of those. If we can make one side equal to the other side, that will constitute a proof of this identity. So, first thing to do, pick a side. It doesn't matter which side. Might be one particular side looks easier to begin with. For instance, you might feel more comfortable using cos and tan than cot and sec. But it doesn't really matter because they should be equal, so you should be able to go from one side to the other. So I'm going to pick the right hand side and hopefully make it equal to the left hand side. So cos over tan is equal to cos times 1 over tan. Nothing too special about that. And tan is equal to sine over cos. So I could rewrite 1 over tan, the flipped reciprocal of tan, as cos over sine. So cos times cos over sine is what I've got at the moment. Cos over sine is equal to cotangent or cot. Now we all know that 1 over tan is equal to cot. I've embellished this a little bit because it's such a simple identity to prove. So I added in a step here I didn't need to add, and because sec is equal to 1 over cosine, therefore 1 over sec has to be equal to cosine, and as you can see I've got cosine there, so that's going to be equal to 1 over sec times cot, and that's the same thing as cot over sec. Now just a bit of algebra, it's just messing about until you find the one side that you wanted to find. So I've taken the right hand side, I've ended up with the left hand side as it looks there. that's a proof. That's what we need to do.